In the previous segment, we saw that modern Europeans developed a kind of explore and conquer mentality that drove them to explore the whole world and to conquer the whole world. This unique mentality is best illustrated by the development of a new type of world maps in early modern Europe. Many cultures prior to modern Europe also drew maps of the whole world. Obviously, no human culture really knew the entire globe. No culture in Africa and Asia, for example, knew about America. And no human society in America knew about Africa and Asia. But this did not prevent them from imagining the whole world and drawing maps of the entire planet. Unfamiliar areas were simply left out of the map, or they were filled with all kinds of imaginary monsters and wonders. These maps, these pre-modern world maps, had no empty spaces in them. They gave you the impression of familiarity with the entire world. Such maps were drawn not only by the Muslims and Chinese and Japanese and Indians, but also by medieval Europeans. You can see here before you a world map from Europe from the year 1459. You see Europe on top, Africa below, and Asia to the right. The most interesting thing about this map is that it is complete. It is completely full of details. Even though Europeans in 1459 didn't know much about Africa and Asia, and didn't know anything about the existence of America and Australia and Antarctica, the map still gives you the impression that the Europeans were familiar with everything there is to know, with the whole world. During the 15th and 16th century, one of the first indications of the scientific revolution and of European imperialism was that Europeans began to draw world maps of a new type, world maps with lots of empty spaces. The empty maps with empty spaces, were a psychological and ideological breakthrough. They were a clear admission that Europeans were ignorant of large parts of the world. The most important change in this respect occurred, of course, in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed westward from Spain, seeking a new trade route to East Asia. Now, according to the calculations of Columbus, which were based on complete world maps from the Middle Ages, Japan should be located about 7,000 kilometers west of Spain. Assuming that this is true, is what caused Columbus to set sail. The truth is, of course, that the maps were wrong. There are more than 20,000 kilometers and an entire unknown continent, America, that separated Spain from Japan. But Columbus didn't know that. On the 12th of October, 1492, at about 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, the expedition of Columbus collided with this unknown continent. A sailor named Juan Rodriguez Bermejo, watching from the mast of the ship Pinta, spotted an island in the islands which we now call the Bahamas, and shouted, "Land, land!" And this was the moment that the world was basically united and changed beyond recognition. But it wasn't realized at first. When Columbus saw this island in the Bahamas, he believed that he has reached a small island off the coast of East Asia, somewhere in Indonesia or the Philippines or Japan. This is why he called the people which he found on the island Indians, because he thought that he has reached India, the Indies. In medieval Europe, East Asia was called the Indies after India. So when they encountered Native Americans, they thought that these were Indians, so they called them Indians. Now, Columbus was wrong, of course, but what is interesting is that he stuck to his error for the rest of his life. He never admitted he never realized that he discovered a new continent. The idea that he discovered a completely unknown continent was simply inconceivable for Columbus and for many of his generation. Because for thousands of years, not only the greatest thinkers of Europe and the greatest scholars, but also holy scriptures of Judaism and Christianity, they knew only about Europe and Africa and Asia. Read the Bible. There is no mention of America in the Bible. And Columbus and his generation, they couldn't get it, that the Bible could have missed half the world. It's impossible. It's like, say, in 1969, on the way to the moon, imagine that Apollo 11, the spaceship, the expedition to the moon, had crashed into an unknown moon, circling the Earth, which nobody previously observed. This is what was the kind of thing that happened to Columbus. He was sure that the whole world is known and that he just have to cross the ocean and get to Japan. How can it be that there is an entire continent that none of the ancient wise people and not even the Bible knew that it existed? In his refusal to admit ignorance, Columbus was still a man of the Middle Ages. He was convinced that he knew the whole world, and even when he encountered America, it wasn't enough to change his views. The first modern man was Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian sailor who took part in several of the first expeditions to America around the year 1500. Between 1502 and 1504, two texts which describe the expeditions to America were published in Europe, and they were attributed to this man, this sailor, Amerigo Vespucci. Now these texts, they argued something revolutionary. They argued that the new lands that Columbus discovered were not islands off the coast of China or Japan or Indonesia, but that this was an entire continent unknown to classical geographers and unknown to the Bible and to contemporary Europeans. 5 years later, in 1507, a very famous German map maker called Martin Waldseemüller, he was convinced by this argument, and he published a new world map, which was the first world map in Europe to show that the new land discovered by Columbus was actually a new continent, a separate continent which has nothing to do with Asia. It's not East Asia, it's a new continent. Now Waldseemüller, when he drew this new map and this new continent, he had to give it a name. He mistakenly believed that Amerigo Vespucci, the person who wrote this text, had been the first person to discover America and not Columbus. So Waldseemüller named the new continent in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, who discovered it. He called it America, because of the name Amerigo. The Waldseemüller map became very popular, and many other cartographers and map makers copied his map along with the name that he gave to the new continent. And there is some poetic justice in the fact that about a quarter of the world, 2 continents out of 7 continents, South and North America, are named after a little-known Italian whose only claim to fame is that he was the first person who had the courage to say, "We don't know. There is here an entire continent which we simply know nothing about." And this was the foundational event of the scientific revolution. The discovery of America is what really began the scientific revolution, because it taught Europeans to favor present observations over past traditions and sacred texts. And the desire to conquer and control America obliged the European conquerors to start searching for new knowledge very, very quickly. If the conquerors, if the Spaniards and Portuguese and later the English and Dutch and French, if they really wanted to control the vast new territories that they found in America, they had to gather enormous amounts of new data about the geography, the climate, the animals, the people, the languages, the cultures of this new continent. All the previous knowledge in the Bible, in Christian scriptures, in all geography book, all the ancient traditions were of little help to you if you wanted to find your way in the new world of America. To understand the depth of this revolution, let's now take a look at another world map drawn in Italy in 1525, about 30 years after Columbus. Whereas the previous map we saw, the one from 1559, is full of continents and islands and very detailed explanations of all the places in the world, the 1525 map, what characterizes it is that it is mostly empty. The eye wanders, look at the area which contains America. You can see here the coast, the western coast of America, and you can follow the coast south and south until suddenly it disappears into empty space. Anyone looking at this world map who has even minimal curiosity is immediately tempted to ask, what's beyond this point? What is there in all the huge blank empty spaces on the map? And the map does not give you any answers. The map admits that we don't know what's out there. And the map invites you, the observer, to set sail and find out for yourself what's out there in the blank spaces. From that point onwards, not only European geographers, but European scholars in almost all other fields of knowledge and science began to draw maps with blank spaces. They began to admit that their theories about physics or biology or economics or whatever are not perfect. There are important things which we simply don't know. In the following centuries, the Europeans were drawn to these blank spaces on the maps as if they were magnets. During the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, European expeditions circumnavigated Africa, explored America, crossed the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and created a network of bases and colonies all over the world. They established the first truly global empires and united the entire globe into a single trade network. The European imperial expeditions transformed the history of the world from many histories of isolated peoples and cultures into a single history of a single integrated human society. These explore and conquer expeditions of the Europeans are so familiar to us that we tend to overlook just how unique and extraordinary they were. Nothing like it had ever happened before in history. Long-distance campaigns of conquest are not a natural undertaking for people, not even for big empires. Throughout history, most human societies, even most kingdoms and empires, they were so busy in local conflicts with their neighbors that they never considered exploring and conquering unfamiliar, distant lands. Most of the great empires of history extended their control only over familiar lands around them. They reached very far places simply because as they kept growing and growing, they came in contact with more and more lands and conquered them too. For example, the Romans at first controlled only the city of Rome in the center of Italy. But then, in order to defend Rome against invasion from the north, they conquered Etruria, what is today Tuscany. Then, in order to defend Etruria, they conquered the Po Valley. and subsequently they conquered Provence, in what is today southern France, to defend the Po Valley. They conquered Gaul in order to defend Provence, and finally they conquered Britain in order to defend Gaul against invasion. It took the Romans about 400 years to get like this, step by step, from Rome to Britain. When in the beginning of the process, say in the 4th century BC, no Roman would have imagined to simply sail directly to Britain, explore it and conquer it. It did happen from time to time that an ambitious ruler or an adventurer would embark on some very long-range campaign of conquest. But such campaigns of conquest, even them, usually tried to conquer an existing and familiar empire, not completely unknown lands. For example, the campaigns of Alexander the Great did not result in the discovery of new lands and the establishment of a new empire. Rather, they were simply an attempt, a successful attempt, to conquer, to take over an existing empire, the empire of the Persians. The closest precedents to the voyages of discovery of the modern Europeans were the voyages of discovery that the Chinese Empire sent in the early 15th century. Between 1405 and 1433, a Chinese admiral, Zheng He, led 7 huge fleets, 7 huge armadas from China to explore the Indian Ocean. The largest of these 7 expeditions contained almost 300 ships and carried close to 30,000 people, sailors, soldiers, officials, and so forth. Zheng He visited and explored to some extent Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and East Africa. In the early 15th century, Chinese ships reached Malindi on the shore of what is today Kenya in East Africa. Compared to the fleet of Zheng He, the fleet of Christopher Columbus in 1492, which consisted of only 3 small ships and 120 sailors, was like a mosquito. I mean, what is 3 ships and 120 sailors that Columbus had compared to Zheng He with 300 ships and 30,000 people? Yet, even though the Zheng He expeditions were very formidable, there was a crucial difference between Zheng He and Columbus. Zheng He, yes, he explored the ocean and he assisted pro-Chinese rulers in southern Asia, but he did not try to conquer or to colonize the countries he visited. And more importantly, these expeditions of Zheng He, they were not deeply rooted in Chinese politics and culture. They were the result of some chance policy of one particular ruling faction in Beijing. When the ruling faction of the Chinese Empire changed in the middle of the 15th century, the overseas expeditions were completely stopped. They were terminated. The great fleet that Zheng He built was dismantled. The technical, the geographical knowledge was lost, and no explorer of such ambition and stature ever set sail again from a Chinese port. The Chinese rulers in the following centuries, like most Chinese rulers in previous centuries, they restricted their interests and ambitions only to East Asia and never again tried to explore and conquer Southern Asia. The Zheng He expeditions are nevertheless very important because they prove that Europe did not enjoy any outstanding technological or economic advantage over the Chinese or over other people. What really made the Europeans exceptional was their ambition, unparalleled ambition, to explore and conquer the world. And the fact that other people, other empires like the Chinese or the Muslims or the Indians, they did not send expeditions to explore and conquer distant and unfamiliar lands, this should not surprise us. And this was not due to lack of ability. It was simply due to lack of interests. The Roman never had any interest in conquering Scandinavia or India. The Persians never attempted to conquer Madagascar or Spain. And the Chinese never attempted to conquer Indonesia or Africa. And again, this shouldn't surprise us, because why should the Romans try to conquer faraway India? Or why should the Chinese try to conquer Indonesia or Africa? What sense does it make? The really strange thing is that early modern Europeans caught some kind of madness that drove them to sail to distant and completely unknown lands, full of alien cultures, take one small step on the beach, and immediately declare, I claim all this land for my country, for my king. This is very, very strange. Even after the Europeans began to send these expeditions of exploring and conquering the world, the other main powers in the world, like the rulers of the Middle East and India and China, they still did not try to compete with them. The European, these expeditions were so strange that even after the great empires of Asia saw what was happening, they didn't try to compete. They heard pretty quickly, the rulers of China or the Ottoman Empire, about the discovery of America, and later about the discovery by Europeans of new lands in Africa, in Australia, in the Pacific Ocean. But even then, the rulers of China and India and the Middle East displayed very little interest in these discoveries. They continued to believe that the world revolves around Asia, and that nothing of importance exists in America or Africa, and therefore they made no attempt to compete with the Europeans for control of America or for control of the new ocean trade routes in the Atlantic and the Pacific. At the time, even very, very small European kingdoms like Scotland and Denmark, they too tried to send a few exploring and conquering expeditions to America. But not one expedition or one exploration or one conquest was ever attempted in America by the Muslims or Indians or Chinese. There was never a case, say, that the Ottoman Sultan sent an army, say in 1600, to try and conquer and explore Mexico or Australia. The first time that a non-European power tried to send a military expedition to America was only in the Second World War, when Japan, in 1942, sent an expedition towards Alaska that managed to conquer two small islands near the Alaskan coast, Kiska and Attu, capturing in the process 10 US soldiers and one dog. This was the closest that any non-European power ever came to waging an invasion of the New World of America. It cannot be argued that they didn't have the means to do it. The Ottomans and the Chinese, they had the technology, and they were close enough. They were not much more distant from America than the Europeans. They had the technological, the economics, the military abilities to reach America and to try to compete with the Europeans for control of the New World. The resources that were enough to send Zheng He with 30,000 people from China to East Africa in the 1420s should have been more than enough to reach America. But the Chinese were just not interested, because they didn't think that there is anything important which they don't already know about. That someplace in a new world there can be something that is important for China. The first world map in China that actually showed America as part of the world was published only in 1602, more than 100 years after Columbus, and even that map was published by a European missionary, not by a Chinese geographer. So, for 300 years after Columbus, the Europeans enjoyed undisputed mastery in America, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean. There were many struggles for controlling these new territories, but all the struggles were between different European powers, or between the European powers and the local population. The big, powerful kingdoms and empires of Asia and Africa did not try to intervene. And it was the resources and the wealth that the Europeans accumulated in these new lands, in America and the oceans in Australia, that eventually gave them enough power to compete with the Asian empires in Asia itself and to defeat them. When the Ottomans, the Persians, the Indians, and the Chinese finally understood that America was important, that the oceans of the world were important, it was already too late. They were already too far behind the Europeans. We see then that what united modern science and the European imperialism was the urge to discover and conquer new things and new lands. The empires supported scientific explorations because these explorations again and again proved themselves very useful. This began when the empires supported geographical expeditions. The first really important science of the scientific revolution was geography, not physics or chemistry or biology. At first, geography was the most important science. It received the biggest investment and it gave back the biggest results. It gave the Europeans mastery over new lands and new oceans. But what began with geography soon spread to other disciplines, other areas, such as medicine and physics and linguistics and economics and anthropology and history and so forth. In the next segment, we will continue to examine how European imperialism and European science became closely connected to each other, and how the empires supported science while the scientists supported and opened the way for empire.